So my biggest piece of advice is if you're going to start a financial news service, start it on the day the global economy breaks. And you're going to have a lot of success, because that's what happened to us. Basically, Alex Bloomberg and I, who did the giant pool of money story, thought, hey, this could be more of an ongoing process. And we spent several months thinking about what that would be, getting a lot of support from our my higher-ups at NPR and from Ira at This American Life. And all the questions and worries and things we thought we had to prepare became absolutely irrelevant on September 6th, the day we launched, which was also the day Fannie and Freddie collapsed. And basically, since then, it's just been a maniacal frenzy of 18-hour days and, creating this podcast, which was going to be a once-a-week podcast. At no point did we sit down and say, let's make it a once-a-day podcast. It just every day there was a podcast to do. We had to do it. And it quickly became #1 in iTunes and has consistently been highly ranked. We created a blog. We are obviously on the radio and have had this enormous response. And what's interesting to me is everything I thought was hard, which is what is the content? What are the stories we're going to tell? What is our approach to storytelling? Was just easy. That was simple. We had all these talks about, should we be funny all the time? Should we be funny some of the time? Should we be poignant? Do we want to make people cry sometimes? That kind of was irrelevant. I mean, it turns out basically, it's pretty simple. Lots of people want to understand finance and economics, but don't understand the jargon. Translate the jargon, put it into a narrative when that makes sense, tell a joke when that makes sense, just be straight when that makes sense, and respect people's intelligence. Finance and economics isn't that hard. It's just usually it's talked about in really weird words that none of us understand, or words we think we understand, but they use differently. That part has been relatively easy. The challenge has been being a sort of entrepreneurial startup in, Dennis, I think it's okay, our CEO is here, a pretty bureaucratic company, and a company that has voracious needs. We have these Morning Edition, All Things Considered, the other news shows. They need to fill content. And for an NPR metric standpoint, we've been remarkably successful. 80,000, I don't know, 100,000 subscribers to the podcast, the most successful blog we've ever had, the most visited page most days. But it's still 100,000, 80,000, 90,000. And when you have these legacy shows that reach 30 million people, it's sometimes hard to justify, hey, I'm going to ignore 30 million people and focus on this smaller thing. And every day has been a struggle to figure out how do you do an entrepreneurial new media venture within an organization that has very specific legacy needs. And I'd love to come here and say, well, yeah, we figured it out. It's all settled. We really haven't, but we have discovered some interesting lessons, which I thought it's worth talking about. I want to say 2 minutes. Jeff and Jay Rosen have been incredibly helpful. I had 2 really good conversations with them before we launched, and I find all this stuff that Jeff talked about earlier makes me feel like, oh, right, I'm not just running around like a madman reacting to things and solving problems. I actually am doing that whole thing. Because what we learned is the Jeff model makes my life easier, that when I learn something, I can put it up, I can get helpful response. We get these emails from congressional staffers or just curious people who are willing to spend a few hours looking through Treasury documents and pointing out inconsistencies. All that process stuff that leads to a product has been really helpful. The thing we haven't figured out yet, and we're working on, is we're basically a blog, a podcast, and we do stories on the radio. And right now, they're all 3 very different things. And I actually haven't decided if it's okay for them to be 3 different things or if they need to be one thing. So the blog is sort of a community where we're in a constant discussion with our listeners. And we've, the 6 weeks we've been alive, we've really developed a very strong and robust audience. The podcast is sort of that. I mean, we do take listener questions every day, but it's basically a radio show that might be a little more casual than our other radio shows, and the radio programs are that finished product.